right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Lunch and Learn today. My name is Callie Turner, and I'm the Curator of Education here at the Orange County Regional History Center. I'd like to welcome everyone joining us here in person or joining us online in the live webinar. Just so you know, we will take questions at the end today. If you are in person, there are Post-it notes with pencils on the table where you can write down your questions, and then Cheyenne will come around and pick them up and we'll read them out. If you are online, you can leave a question or a comment in the chat and we'll be sure to have someone read them out to us. But this afternoon, you are all in for a very special treat because you will be hearing from 5 different members of our extremely talented education team. As the title suggests for today's Lunch and Learn, they will all be sharing their favorite artifacts or story from Central Florida's rich history. Some stories are likely fan favorites, while others may be stories about lesser known artifacts in our collections. But no matter the subject, you're sure to learn something new today. So without further ado, please help me welcome Courtney, Matthew, Anna, Griffin, and Lily.
Can everybody hear me? I'm a little tall, so I need to adjust this. All right, well, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Courtney Burns, and I am the Assistant Curator of Education here at the History Center. I am going to talk about my favorite collection in the museum today, which is our Highwayman paintings, but in particular, I'm going to speak about Miss Mary Ann Carroll, who was the only female Florida highwayman who traversed Florida's highways in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. I chose her because not only is she my favorite artist of the bunch, but a lot of her legacy and the other highwaymen's legacy has inspired a lot of the programming that we do today in the museum, both in and out in our community. So, without further ado, I'm going to talk first a little bit about Mary Ann's history. So of the 26 Florida highwaymen who traversed the highways up and down the state of Florida in the 50s and 60s, Mary Ann Carroll was the only woman. The highwaymen were mostly located in Fort Pierce, mentoring one another in art styles and helping each other find cheap, unconventional materials to paint on and frame their art pieces with before selling them to local businesses, banks, and government buildings to make a living. 1950s and 60s Florida was still under the stranglehold of Jim Crow. For most Black Floridians, their job options in Florida were in the citrus groves, house cleaning, or other laborious work. Between 1865 and 1967, Florida had passed 19 Jim Crow laws, with harsher penalties for breaking the law than any of the other southern states in the United States. Mary Ann Carroll during this time was raising 7 children. She was not making enough money as a maid or a citrus picker to support her family, but through connections with fellow highwayman Harold Newton and her childhood passion of drawing the world around her as she saw it, Mary began traveling the state while her children were in school. It's important to understand the magnitude of Mary Ann Carroll's heroism. The Florida highwaymen, painting their beautiful scenes of various parts of Florida, were often selling to businesses that would not serve them, places such as banks, restaurants, hotels, courthouses, and the like. Violence of many kinds toward Black people were at an all-time high, and this was magnified tenfold for that of Black women. Mary took a risk every time she knocked on a door, traveled to or through certain Florida towns that the male highwaymen would avoid, such as Okeechobee, or walked through the lobby of a building that had separate entrances for white and Black people in hopes of selling her artwork to support her children. Her family and faith is what drove her to work as hard as she did. In addition to being a painter whose works were driving higher in demand, Mary became a pastor of the Foundation Revival Center of Redemption in Fort Pierce later in life, also singing with the Wings of Faith chorus throughout Florida. She truly was an artist in many ways. Mary passed away in December of 2019 at the age of 79, leaving behind a legacy as the trailblazing Black artist she was. Oh, excuse me. The art style of the highwaymen is inspired by a white painter named A.E. Bacchus. Bacchus was the one who taught the founder of the group, Alfred Hare, everything he knew about painting landscapes. At the time, an art teacher inviting a Black student, let alone multiple, was considered scandalous. But it was here in the Bacchus studio where not only the birth of the highwayman's legacy, but the birth of Florida landscape art is considered to be. Because the highwaymen worked on quantity so they could sell more paintings, They would paint on materials such as chipboard and fiberboard and used repurposed crown molding that they decorated, painted, and attached themselves so the wet paintings could stack on each other in the car without damaging the other paintings. The highwaymen painted Florida as they saw it, even if Jim Crow laws prohibited them from going to some of the places, such as beaches, that they would paint. Their artwork involves a lot of texture, quick brushstrokes, and bold, bright colors. They moved quick, with Mary Ann Carroll averaging a painting a day later on in her career. In order to keep the paint colors from muddying, they would layer their work and allow it to partially dry before adding the next layer, using blues, yellows, reds, pinks, and purples to represent the sky. They would start with that and allow it to dry, while they then moved on to points of interest and the horizon line using the rule of thirds. Using the rule of thirds, landscape artists use 2 horizontal and 2 vertical lines to divide their canvas into 9 equal parts. This helps them find that sweet spot to lay their horizon line and decide where to This helps them to find the sweet spots to lay their horizon line and decide where to put the next point of interest in their work. For the highwaymen, this would be things such as cypress trees with hanging Spanish moss or palm trees. In the case of Mary Ann Carroll, her favorite pieces, including one gifted to former First Lady Michelle Obama in 2011, included poinciana trees. They would paint these points of interest and then include some smaller details, such as width of darker paint to indicate birds in flight, or white paint and water to give it a shine that makes it feel like a piece of beautiful, undisturbed Florida. Once they were done with their paintings, they would attach and decorate their frames and be on to the next painting, or they'd hit the road to sell it. So to honor the legacy of the highwaymen, both in Central Florida and throughout the state, the History Center has implemented a number of educational programming and activities related to their artwork and impact. First, the History Center keeps a permanent display of select highwaymen art from our collection up on the 2nd floor in the Celebrating Community exhibit right across the hall. We currently have a few pieces of art from Mary Ann Carroll on display at the City Hall for her individual exhibit, which was curated by the City of Orlando's Public Arts Coordinator, Flynn Dobbs. That exhibit is on display until June 22nd. Here at the History Center, we feature the highwaymen in our field trip programs. Our Breaking Barriers tour features tours through 3 exhibits, a mock trial in the courtroom, and an art activity in one of our classrooms. Students may have the opportunity to meet Mary Ann Carroll, who was portrayed by one of our actresses, Val Gamble, who was pictured in the slide. Val developed the script for Mary Ann Carroll based off of our internal research on her and by studying video and photo of her mannerisms and appearance. She greets students on the 2nd floor by the highwayman art and talks about her life on the road as an artist. In the activity room, students will learn about the highwaymen's lives during Jim Crow and learn about their art style. Then, on chipboard and with oil pastels, students will create their own highwayman pieces to take home with them at the end of their tour. We also host an annual Highwayman Kids exhibit, with this year being our 8th year taking part. You may have noticed some absolutely stellar pieces of artwork on the 1st floor as you walked in today. This year, 350 students from OCPS's Academic Center for Excellence, Howard Middle School, and Westridge Middle School took part. Participating art teachers are set a lesson plan made by us, and it teaches them about the highwaymen and their art style, which they use in their classrooms for about 2 weeks. Then they spend another week learning about the art style. They're given 3 pieces of chipboard per student, 2 for practice and 1 to submit for the competition, and their own paint packs complete with paintbrushes and acrylic paint. The art teachers then choose between 15 and 20 pieces to submit for the exhibit, and we have an internal and external panel of judges select 3 winners, 1 from each school. Our participants were given a prize pack courtesy of the History Center and Sam Flax, and our winners were given additional gift cards and tickets to some of our community partners. Our Highwayman Kids exhibit is on the 1st floor and will be up until May 19th. I would like to invite all of you today to check out the art by some absolutely amazing young artists in our community. I'd love for this event to grow next year so we can continue to spread the legacy of Mary and her fellow highwaymen for years to come. Thank you, and now I'd like to introduce Matt Kuntz.
Hello, hello, how are we doing today? So my name is Matthew Kuntz, and I am one of the museum educators here in the education department. I've been here for about 1.5 years, and today I will be talking to you all about the Winter Park sinkhole, which some of you might be familiar with, some of you might not, and that's okay. That's what I'm here today. So, After this presentation, I would love to invite you all to the 4th floor in our natural environment exhibit, where we have an interactive display showcasing sinkholes, their formation, and the different types of sinkholes, as well as a little section dedicated to the Winter Park sinkhole itself. On the evening of May 8th, 1981, a sinkhole began to form on the corner of Fairbanks Avenue and Denning Drive in Winter Park, Florida. Seemingly overnight, the sinkhole rapidly expanded into a destructive force. Though sinkholes are not uncommon in Florida, the intensity and culture surrounding the Winter Park sinkhole is something that will forever be a part of Central Florida's history. Within a few hours of the sinkhole's formation, a sycamore tree was already claimed. By the morning of the 9th, the sinkhole grew to nearly 40 feet in diameter. By noon, a house owned by local resident May Rose Williams, at the time her last name was Owens, was slowly sinking into the ever-growing hole. Williams and her family evacuated the house, however, not all of their belongings were able to be recovered. Though her home was destroyed, the community came together to raise $50,000 to help the family rebuild their home and on a new plot of land. Williams was not the only victim of the sinkhole, however. Over the next few days, a local auto repair shop located in the area lost 5 Porsches. An unrelated camper van, the Winter Park Municipal Pool, and parts of Denning Drive were lost as well. Damages totaled to an estimate between $2 and $4 million, and around 250 cubic yards of soil fell into the sinkhole. Up here on the screen is one of the aerial photos of the sinkhole itself. The portion of the street that got destroyed is Denning Drive, so Fairbanks Avenue is up at the top. We also have another photo of the sinkhole at the ground level. That blue car that we see in that picture is one of those Porsches. It is one of the most infamous Porsches that was lost. We also have a picture of the tree as well, one of those sycamore trees. Despite the destruction, the Winter Park sinkhole drew in a bit of tourism to the area. Almost immediately, vendors set up stalls between and around the sinkhole beginning already on May 11th. So within 2-3 days, we already started having a new tourist spot. T-shirts, balloons, and food stands popped up, drawing in a large crowd of visitors. On July 9th, 1981, the city of Winter Park began selling photographs of the sinkhole for education and tourism purposes. The sinkhole was filled with water, but around 2 weeks later, on July 19th, the water and the base level of the sinkhole dropped an additional 15 to 20 feet. So up here, I have a picture of one of those mentioned t-shirts. This one says, "I pulled the Porsche," which was a common t-shirt that they sold around that time because some people actually did help pull those Porsches out of the sinkhole. In the picture to the left, we do have a photograph of Miss Williams's home that was destroyed. And thinking about, in a whole day, her entire home was just slowly sinking into the center of that sinkhole. The sinkhole's time in the limelight eventually wore off. The tourist hotspot's popularity eventually waned and was repaired by city workers. They managed to pull out that camper van, and 3 of those 5 Porsches were actually pulled out. The sinkhole has remained stable ever since, except for a brief time in 1987 when the bottom dropped an additional 20 feet. The eventual size of the Winter Park sinkhole is 90 feet deep with a 320-foot diameter, and it was then established as a lake. In honor of Miss May Rose Williams, it was renamed to Lake Rose, where it currently sits behind a coffee shop. And up here, I just have a little clip of Google Maps showing the new location right now with where it currently sits behind a coffee shop called Austin's Coffee, which I highly recommend if you are ever in the area. So I would like to bring up my fellow educator, Miss Anna.
Hello, hello. Good afternoon. Let me see here. Okay. So, good day, everyone. I am Anna, a museum educator here at the History Center, and today we'll explore the history of the Timucuan people and their interactions with Spanish colonizers in Florida. We'll delve into their society, the impact of European contact, their enduring legacy, and some interesting stories and characters that I've learned through my research that I'd like to share with y'all. So right here, we have a quote that kind of ties together European sentiments towards the indigenous peoples. Without settlement, there is no good conquest, and if the land is not conquered, the people will not be converted. Therefore, the maxim of the conqueror must be to settle. This quotation is from Francisco López de Gomara, a historian in the service of Hernán Cortés, describing the philosophy behind the Spanish conquest of the Americas in the 16th century, and captures the interrelated goals and strategies of the Spaniards as they sought to create permanent presence in the New World. So, who and where are the Timucuan people? So, the Timucua were indigenous people who inhabited much of northern and central Florida, as well as parts of southern Georgia. They lived, ate, learned, and slept, exactly where most of you live, eat, learn, and sleep today. We cover them and the St. Johns River people in our fourth floor natural environment exhibit. They were organized into chiefdoms and had a matrilineal society, meaning lineage was traced through the mother's line. Their economy was based on fishing, hunting, and agriculture, cultivating crops like corn, beans, and squash. The Timucuans' first recorded contacts with Europeans was possibly with Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de León in 1513. Later, in 1564, French Huguenots established Fort Caroline, leading to initial alliances with the Timucuans. The Spanish, under Pedro Menéndez de Áviles, founded St. Augustine in 1565, leading to conflicts and eventual Spanish dominance. At that time, almost all Timucuan communities along the middle of the St. Johns River were loosely organized into regional societies under a powerful chief named Utina. However, these relationships would soon be tested as European powers vied for regional control. So, the Spanish initially occupied the Timucuan village of Saloy, leading to hostilities that caused the colonists to temporarily relocate to Anastasia Island. They returned to the mainland by 1572, settling at the site of modern St. Augustine. Following the establishment of St. Augustine, Spanish missionaries began to set up missions among the Timucua chiefdoms. The Franciscan missionaries aimed to Christianize the Timucuan people. While these missions preserved aspects of the Timucuan language, they also led to significant cultural changes in hopes of assimilating them. All of the known Eastern Timucua tribes were incorporated into the Spanish mission system starting in the late 16th century. In 1539, Hernando de Soto led an army of more than 500 men in a devastating entrada through central and north Florida. His army seized food, took women for consorts, and forced men to serve as guides and bearers. The army fought 2 battles with the Timucua, killing hundreds. De Soto also released hogs into the forest to breed a food supply for later expeditions, and these hogs preyed on traditional Timucuan food sources and were in turn hunted by them, further changing their habitat and lifestyle. Hernando de Soto, in this expedition, led it through the Swanee Valley region of Florida, like up north, encountering the Timucua people. The area was governed by 2 principal Timucuan chiefs, Agua Calenquin and Usachile, who were likely related. De Soto captured Chief Agua Calenquin, intending to release him upon Usachile's territory. However, subordinate chiefs claiming Usachile sought an alliance with the Spaniards led De Soto's army into an ambush near the town of Nepatuqua. When one of the chiefs struck De Soto, the captives were executed by arrows fired by enslaved Indians from the Tampa Bay area. This event, known as the Nepatuqua Massacre, marked the first large-scale massacre by Europeans on what later became U.S. soil. So, colonists soon began to use these factors to develop a transnational identity to explain native differences and define a European Floridian identity. In response to manifestations of colonialism, natives generated their own understandings of human beings and resisted settler encroachment both verbally and violently, and reasserted collective native Floridian identities elsewhere. Settlers attempted to intellectually distance themselves from the Floridian Indians from the earliest contacts between the two groups. But despite all of this, there are also many accounts of assimilated and converted Timucuan and Floridian natives who cohabitated with the Spaniards and formed lasting bonds with the European settlements. In my research, one of the most important stories and most fascinating to me was Doña Maria. Her picture is right here on the lower right-hand side. Doña Maria was the ruler of the town Nombre de Dios during the 1580s and the 1590s. The Timucuans often had women rulers. She was Christian, and her mother, who had been the ruling chief before her, was one of the very early Timucua converts to Christianity. Doña Maria married a Spanish soldier named Clemente de Bernal, and he lived with her at Nombre de Dios. Doña Maria saved the residents of St. Augustine from starvation in 1587 by supplying them with large quantities of corn when the town was flooded with hundreds of refugees, not only from the abandonment of Santa Elena, but also of the survivors of 5 Spanish shipwrecks that occurred off of the shores of Florida that year. So, like all Timucuan chiefs, she was part of a hereditary elite class respected by the Spaniards as nobles. Her son became the chief of another Timucua Indian mission town, San Juan del Porto, in the 17th century. Now, despite repeated attempts to settle the area for more than 2 centuries, Europeans maintained only a marginal presence in the Floridas, especially when compared to other settings in the Western Hemisphere that colonizers infiltrated at a much later date. The relationships between Native Americans and European Americans in the regions were based on mutual limitations rather than exclusive hegemony well into the 19th century. However, in 1647, the Appalachians and the Chiscas rebelled against the Spanish forced labor. The revolt led to the burning of churches and the killing of friars, followed by a Spanish military response. In an unexpected turn of events, the Timucuans who were converted by Christianity and Spanish culture eventually supported the Spanish powers. So the Spanish responded by sending a force of 31 soldiers and 500 Timucua warriors against the rebels, engaging in a fierce day-long battle. The Timucuan Indians themselves rebelled in 1656 because they had been mistreated by the Spaniards, oversharing their crops and having to transport these goods themselves. In the Timucuan Rebellion of 1656, it led to 11 of their chiefs executed on the orders of the Spaniard Cañizares. Such resistance highlighted the tensions between indigenous populations and colonial authorities. So these pictures right here are the Timucua tribe going to war, and the bottom text roughly translates to Florida leaders go to war. And I really enjoyed that one. And then this one down here is also them firing arrows into the fort in St. Augustine because it was initially their own fort, so they had prior knowledge of it. So, the legacy of the Timucuan people. The Timucua population suffered a dramatic decline after European contact. By 1595, their numbers had decreased approximately 75%, primarily due to epidemics of the new infectious disease introduced by Europeans and the effects of war. By the 18th century, the Timucua population had dwindled significantly, with many assimilating into other groups, like the Seminoles, or perishing. Although the Timucua were largely assimilated or disappeared by the mid-18th century, their language and cultural practices have been preserved through missionary records and archaeological findings. Modern efforts continue to study and honor the Timucua heritage in Florida, like here at the History Center on the 4th floor. The interactions between the Spanish and the Timucua in St. Augustine reflect a complex history of initial cooperation, cultural exchange, and eventual conflict. The Spanish missions played a significant role in altering the Timucuan way of life, and the population decline due to disease and warfare had lasting effects on the indigenous community. Understanding this history is crucial to acknowledging the rich and diverse heritage of Florida. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm Anna. I'd like to introduce my good friend, Griffin.
Hello, everybody. My name is Griffin Minkowski. I'm also an educator here at the History Center, but I'm also an archaeology student at UCF. So I will be taking a archaeological approach to the Timucua, but we're going to go into deep history. We're going to go 14,000 years into the past. So I will be focusing specifically on subsistence strategies. Basically, what do these people eat? How do we know what they ate? And what archaeology shows. So this is the artifact I have chosen. It is a deer jaw bone with a chert, which is a kind of lithic projectile lodged into it. I picked this piece because it gives us a really cool snapshot of an in-action process regarding how past Florida people actually hunted and what they ate, and it's great to have that all into one thing. This piece is located on the 4th floor in the Natural Environment exhibit, where Anna was talking about the Timucua, and it is located adjacent to the shell midden. I also work at Cape Canaveral doing archaeology there, so this piece is important to me because I dig up a lot of bones and a lot of projectiles, so to see them together is very cool. All right. So here's a quick refresher before we get into the deep history about the indigenous people of Central Florida. So we do call these people the Timucua, but there were really many different groups of indigenous people all throughout Central Florida with different names. The Timucua, as Anna was saying, were the most prevalent and held the most connections with different groups and resided mainly in the northern part of the state and all along the coast. We know this from Spanish contact period writings and diaries, as well as archaeologically distinct artifacts. Archaeological evidence has actually shown that the first human activity ever in Florida aligned with what we call the Pleistocene, which is basically the last ice age that we had, where changing environments drove people down into Florida. Basically, the up top was frozen, so it made people come down. The best evidence we have to support this 14,000 years ago statement is from 71 radiocarbon dates from the Page Landon site in the Panhandle. So it radiocarbon dated these artifacts that showed that people butchered or even scavenged a mastodon at the Assia River. I think that's how you say it, Assia River. Yeah, so that's that. All right, so we're going to start back 14,500 years ago in the Pleistocene. So this is very early in Florida human history. Florida was almost twice the size of what it was now due to low sea levels. If we remember, it's the Ice Age. All the water's frozen, right? So that sucks it all up, and Florida's much larger. Megafauna, these huge animals such as mastodons and ground sloths inhabited Florida, and that's what humans would go after. Early humans would scavenge or maybe sometimes hunt these animals that would provide groups or provide food for small hunter-gatherer groups. So at this time, they're in small groups, they're moving from place to place, there's no agriculture, and people would also populate near fresh and saltwater sources as there would be more reliable animal activity there. You know the deer is going to go to the pond because the pond's always there, right? So aquatic sources were also probably utilized, and people would eat a lot of fish, as well as a lot of shellfish. So shells are a big deal in archaeology because we find those all the time. Plant life, such as berries or wild onions or other kinds of fruits, were collected and foraged and supported a large component of the diet, probably larger than what we imagine because the plant remains aren't as visible in the archaeological record. They kind of go away, right? So we have to use chemical analysis to find out what they ate. So, archaeologically, we see this evidence through sites specifically made for processing large game, like these mastodons I was talking about, where artifacts such as chert scrapers, clovis points, and bones with butcher marks are present. Up on the presentation slide here, I have a clovis point. That is the culture that's associated with the Pleistocene as much. and it would have come from more northern in America that would come down into Florida as people brought it. So now we're going to move to the Archaic period. The Archaic period is from 9,500 BC to 3,000 BC, so it's a long period of time. And of course, archaeologists like to split that up into a bunch of miniature time periods within that, but we're going to go over this big one here. So, after the Pleistocene came the Archaic period, and people began to kind of settle into Florida more and started to band into larger groups. They began to hunt for a wider variety of animal life and continue to draw on resources from the water. Tools became smaller and finer and more expendable as technology improved and populations increased. For example, atlatls, which is that wooden stick thing right there, were used to propel spears when hunting, improving range and accuracy. We also see the beginnings of pottery during this time, which is really important. It tells us that people are starting to stay in one place more often. They have time to make and build pottery, which also tells us that they were storing some food items. Plant life was still being collected from the wild, so not as much agriculture, but it was being paired with wider protein resources. Also, things called shell middens were basically these big piles of refuse from the community were starting to appear. People would dump all their shells or broken pieces of pottery or bones from their meal into these piles, and archaeologists can sort through these middens and systematically dig them up to see what kind of food was being eaten. Typical things on the menu included fresh and saltwater mollusks, deer, fish, sharks, and rays. So up on the screen, I have a Bolin beveled point, which is a smaller point compared to that Clovis point. You can see it's much more detailed, it's much more refined. It's got that nice place to lash it on to a sphere, right? And we also, I put oyster shells up there because that is something we find a lot, especially at Cape Canaveral. We found oyster shells that people shuck and eat, just as we do today. We have the deer to represent the artifact that I was talking about earlier, and we also have a Florida croaker, which is a kind of fish. And then I have this great picture of a shell midden, and you can see it's kind of sliced in the middle. That's all shells that's been piled up from many, many, many years of dumping trash, basically. So, moving on, we're going to go to the Malabar period. This happens after the Archaic period, and it's from about 500 BC to AD 1565. There's a little bit of time in between the Malabar period and the Archaic period that people call the Orange period, which has some other characteristics, which are not really significant for subsistence, but they appear later on. So yeah, this is when people began to really settle into Florida, and it's like semi-permanent occupations, and group becomes much larger, and they're governed by chiefdoms. So now, specialized, detailed tools for subsistence reach their peak, with items like fishing nets, fishing hooks, sinkers to weigh down the net, scrapers, exotic points, and more being found. So these shell middens that I had mentioned in the last side, they become more localized and smaller. So like your personal trash pit instead of the community's trash pit, right? Yes. And structures are arising and become clustered together, kind of like the beginnings of like a mini town. And in some cases, they are walled in. We see this evidence through post-hole staining, which is literally if you dig down into the dirt, you can see a different color of dirt where a post hole would have been. Because the Malabar period extends into the contact period with the Europeans, we can extract a lot of information from personal European diaries about what the Timucuans ate and how they got it. One of the best accounts archaeologists have from this period is Jonathan Dickinson's diary, which was a first-hand account of the 1696 wreck of the ship Reformation. This was on Cape Canaveral, and where it crashed along the coast. This was about the Ais people, who were a coastal community whose staple foods were fish, oysters, shellfish, turtles, berries, sea grapes, and I've even found some alligator teeth. Agriculture did exist as documented by European accounts, but mainly occurred inland, where we think of that plowing and stuff. Maize was grown, but it was mainly grown inland, and some of it was traded due to increased contact during this period. Not only were the Timucuans having contact with the Europeans, but they were also having contact with other people above them, and everything was becoming a lot more connected. We also find foreign artifacts at these sites as well that can tell us there's a lot more communication happening. Archaeological evidence also comes from a really particular subfield of archaeology called paleoethnobotany, where starch grains stuck to pottery pieces are analyzed on the microscopic level and identified and compared to modern starch grains. Recently, UCF anthro undergraduate students used this method paired with 17th century accounts to try and recreate a kind of bread called kunti bread, which is made from starch of the palm of the kunti palm on the screen. And they were semi-successful. It was gross, but it worked. Yeah. So on the screen right here, I have some awesome representations of the stuff we would find during the Malabar period. We have the net from King Marco Cave or whatever that is preserved, and it's all made of natural materials, like organic materials, but it's been preserved in the unique environment they have there. I have the kunti palm, which is up there, and the starch would have been extracted and made into kind of a dough. I have a drumfish. We find a lot of drumfish teeth at coastal sites because they have a palate that grinds instead of chomps like a shark. And we get scared because we're like, human teeth, but no, it's just a fish, so don't worry. Up on the screen, I also have a sinker. This is also from the King Marco site that would weigh down the nets that allowed it to cover the fish. I have an alligator because we find alligator teeth and alligator scoots sometimes. And then I have a representation of a European depiction of Timucua people doing agriculture. It is a little bit European aesthetic. We can kind of see that everyone's a little bit lighter and they're using European style tools, but really they would have used indigenous tools like this shell hammer, this Welsh shell hammer we find. I found a few of these at Cape Canaveral with my group through my university, and they're very cool because you can see exactly how it's been worn away on the top using it as a plow or as a hammer. All right, so this was a very brief and condensed overview of the diet of the past Florida peoples. This time ranges that we've covered has spanned thousands of years, and weather conditions, disease, and preference probably impacted subsistence and diet. Archaeologists are still currently working on uncovering the full story of Florida's past. Florida has a very wet environment, so it makes preservation particularly difficult. So anything we find, we're excited to have and analyze it more. But food will always be something that people can relate to, and I hope you have enjoyed this food-based window into the past, and I will now welcome up my coworker, Lily.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lily Von Carroll, and I'm another one of the educators here at the History Center. Now, I am a lover of odd stories, so I picked probably one of the oddest stories I could find today, and we are going to learn a little bit more about armadillo baskets, as well as how Florida ended up with another critter. So, as a critter enthusiast myself, this artifact has always drawn my attention. Now, this one is up on the 4th floor. You might have passed it in the Pioneer cabin where it sits on the floor right next to the spinning wheel. And it is probably my all-time favorite artifact we have here at the History Center. Now, this basket, while looks very unique, is not actually something you would find in Florida. As you might be surprised to hear, the 9-banded armadillo, which this basket is made out of, has never been a species that is native to Florida. A lot of these baskets here were popular in the early 1900s. Most of them were produced down south in Texas on armadillo farms, and this is because during the 1900s, Texas was the only state to have an armadillo population. Charles A. Pelt of the A. Pelt Armadillo Company and Farm in Comfort, Texas, is credited with developing this really unique item. Charles was a German immigrant living in Texas, and he used his skills as a craftsman to create these baskets made out of the 9 banded armadillo shells. In 1904, he ended up displaying his creations at the St. Louis World Fair, where it only grew in popularity, and eventually the A. Pelt Farm became the largest producer of these baskets. At their peak, they were selling about 100 baskets per week at a price between $2.50 to $15. You can see this ad here from the Evening Tribune in Cocoa, and they were quite popular ads. Now, they came plain like our artifact here, but you could also get them decorated in silk and ribbons, just depending on what your personal style was. And you could find them quite often in department stores around Orlando. But flash forward to today, it is quite hard to imagine Florida armadillo-less. Now, armadillos, the 9-banded armadillo specifically, is the largest armadillo breed and also has the largest range. While others are usually found more in South and Central America, the 9-banded armadillo has been found as far north as Illinois and Nebraska, and it's believed that they actually have not reached the full extent of their range. So this does beg the question, if armadillos are not native to Florida, how did they get here? And why are there so gosh darn many? Now, the answer to this question can be found with this man here, Mr. Gus Calloway Edwards. Gus was born March 28th in 1886 in Cornelia, Georgia. He was the son of a prominent attorney that would join his father's practice in 1912. While working under the firm J.C. Edwards & Son, Gus would meet a client, S.F. Travis. Now, anyone familiar with Cocoa might recognize the F.S. Travis store in Cocoa Village, which is the same person. Travis ended up inviting Gus out to Cocoa on the East Coast, and in October of 1915, Gus would make his move down south to the town. He quickly gained influence here and became the city's attorney actually a week after he arrived. Now, Gus also found his footing in the real estate business, and with an associate, he bought land in a housing development known as Highland Park. If you're familiar with Cocoa, this is the area around the water tower and the library, just a little bit north of where Cocoa Village is. Now, as a plan to attract people to this development, Gus came up with the idea of creating a zoo. The Cocoa Zoo officially opened November 5th of 1921, featuring a vast menagerie of animals that included native Florida animals such as the opossum, he had deer, and the always popular alligator, as well as a selection of exotic animals, including monkeys, goldfish, and a parrot that could say the word cocoa. He also ended up bringing over several curious armadillos. At this point, armadillos were extremely foreign to Florida, and most often were seen in zoos like this or in circuses. Now, seeing as people did not know much about these armadillos, it is not surprising that they were unfamiliar with the habits of these little oddfellows. You see, they did not know that they were fantastic burrowers. So when they put the armadillo in a cage that only had a dirt floor as the ground, you can guess their surprise when they came back to an empty enclosure, as the armadillos had successfully pulled off the greatest animal escape ever seen in Florida's Atlantic coast. The Cocoa Zoo would soon close, however, in 1923, having been open for only 2 years, as Gus turned his attention to a little island just off the coast known as Cocoa Beach. Now, the animals here were sold, and there weren't many mentions of armadillos after that. But armadillos are pretty hardy creatures. You see, they have a quick reproduction rate and reach sexual maturity at about 18 months and have 4 identical pups
every year. So it did not take long for sightings to occur, starting right here with the first one in 1926, featured in the Evening Tribune, just three years after the closure of the zoo. Reverend G.T. Bennett claimed to have spotted a strange animal in Sharps, a town that's about 20 minutes north of where the zoo was located. Articles cite Gus's Zoo as the source of where these armadillos came from, but this animal was never captured and managed to escape back into the wilderness. But reports from the Evening Tribune would continue throughout the next 2 decades, sporting headlines such as, "Train killed Armadillo Friday," and "Rockledge Mayor makes capture of armadillo." All of these reports still make some mention of Gus's Zoo in Highland Park as to where the armadillos came from. Now, Cocoa was not the only city seeing an increase in armadillos. By the 1940s, sightings were occurring in areas of Tampa, Bradenton, and the West Coast, down south in Stewart and Fort Pierce, up north near St. Augustine and Jacksonville, and even here in Orlando. It's hard to tell if all of these armadillos were the offspring of the Cocoa Zoo armadillos, or if they were a result of similar freak escapes. But most reports during these times were pointing a finger at Gus and his zoo as the source of all of these armadillos. And by the mid-century, the armadillo population was growing rapidly, so much so that it was starting to impact local growers. Farmers found that the little burrowers were destroying their crops and eating their food, so the state of Florida decided to step in, and in 1946, Florida put a bounty out on this incredible invasive species. They were offering $1, which today turns out to be $23, for every armadillo a person could hunt. You only had to bring the 2 front teeth of the animal to prove that it was dead to the proper authorities to claim your reward. Now, this bounty was not the only way Floridians were trying to get rid of the armadillo problem, as the Evening Star would publish a lot of different recipes on how to prepare armadillos for dinner. These recipes included these ones you see on the screen, like the baked or barbecued armadillo, and they even suggest serving them with a side of sweet potatoes or even a tossed salad. Pretty yummy. Now, it's no wonder that these animals are nicknamed the Hoover Hog by Texans during the Great Depression, although some adventurous eaters say it tastes a little bit more like greasy turkey than it does like pork. Now, today, it is obvious that these attempts to control the armadillo population in Florida had failed. Armadillos still run wild throughout the state, and they can be spotted on nature trails throughout the state of Florida, even in neighborhoods, and also especially turned over on the sides of roads. For over a century now, the wonderful little critters called Florida their home, and although they were first introduced as an invasive species, today they are considered to be completely naturalized. So whenever you see a little armadillo out in the wild, don't think of it as a pest, don't think of it as a future piece of roadkill, or even a little basket. Think of it as the descendant of the greatest escape artist Coco has ever seen. Thank you, guys.
Well, thank you so much to all of our wonderful education team members who spoke today. If you have questions for any of them, you can write them down on that little Post-it note on your table. Someone will come around and get them, perhaps. If you have it, you can hold it up. Anybody? Okay, we have some over here. We'll do those first, and then we'll take audience questions from here in the chat as well. Would you guys want to all come stand up here just in case they have a question for you? Oh my goodness, we have so many good questions. We're gonna have to take turns coming up here as you answer because of the Orange TV mic. All right. Okie dokie. Ooh, there's a lot of questions on this one. I'm going to try to do it by person to make this work. All right. Our first questions are for Courtney, if you want to come over here. First question is any reason why they were mostly in Fort Pierce? Second question is how did Mary Ann's paintings impact environmental advocacy in Florida, or was there even an impact, and if so, what was the extent? Yeah.
All right, thank you. So the first question I'm going to answer is, this is not mine.
That's not mine.
Here, you can take that. I'll answer the other one then. So how did her paintings impact environmental advocacy in Florida? I can be very honest, I don't know the full answer to this, but I do know that a lot of the impact that this created did result in beaches becoming less segregated over time. It did not happen sooner than desegregation in the state of Florida, but as the painters developed closer relationships with some of the businessmen in Fort Pierce and throughout South Florida, thank you, they were able to create these personal relationships that helped them advocate for these desegregated places for them to go to. A lot of the places that Mary would go to, especially in Okeechobee, she was not allowed to spend a lot of time in because most of it was segregated. The second question is, why were only three schools represented in the Highwayman Kids Art Program? And it's because that is all I can afford. So if the community initiatives budget that I operate with every year only allows for me to provide enough art supplies for 3 schools. It is my goal to double that in the next year or two and then to triple it after that. So, yeah.
Griffin Sachs.
Hello, I have a lot of questions, so sorry about this. All right, so the first one is what part of the palm was made to make the bread? There is a tuber root almost, a kind of potato-esque root at the bottom of the palm. The undergraduate team, I'm a master's student, but they were in my excavation unit. They worked on a project where they ground up the fibrous bulb and put it in water. The starch would separate out and the water would be on top, the starch on bottom. They would take the starch, mix it, and make a kind of gross little dough with it, and bake it. So it would be the bottom root part of the palm. There's a couple different palm or tubers they would use to do that, but they especially worked on the Kunti palm. So the chert. The chert is a volcanic glass. How did they get chert into Central Florida? So there's 2 ways. There was trade before. It was not as established in the earlier time, but there was trade. Also, we do have some washing up of rocks and stuff, and also they wouldn't be constricted to chert. They also used things like antler and bone. We find a lot of that, especially in the Archaic period, where it was whittled down and made those smaller projectile points. So bone was a big deal, and we find a lot of that as well. What were the sinkers made of for the Marco Island fish nets? So the one I put up on the screen was a stone. It was a stone that was probably traded, or it was made of really compacted bedrock. And when I say bedrock, our bedrock is, sand, so it's easier to, yeah. Also, shells. Lots of shells would be used. They would carve and attach to the net all the way around, and we would bring it down. And you can actually tell the difference between natural mollusk predation versus carved because of the style of the hole. You can actually tell if it was man-altered or animal-altered. Was the projectile point an arrow in the deer draw? Yes, it was probably from an arrow made from an atlatl, or later in the periods they also had bows that was featured in Anna's presentation. Yeah, there's tons of archaeology history that I wasn't able to cover, but please look into it. It's awesome. Yeah, that was all the questions that I had on mine. Thank you.
Hello. So my question about the armadillos is, how many armadillos did the zoo actually have? Now, this I could not find, although they do have a lot of newspaper articles with numbers of what animals they had in the zoos. The armadillos escaped so quickly that they weren't featured in any of the ads. So we know it was at least 2, but we don't know exactly how many were able to escape.
Yes.
So the question that I received was that Porsche Northam's collection? Now, it didn't specify in the research about who owned those Porsches, other than that those Porsches were sitting at that auto repair shop being worked on by the time the sinkhole, popped up and started taking out the road with it.
Alrighty, do we have any online questions? No? Great. We have one right here. Yes.
I have a local massive armadillo event there that took place in the 1960s, I believe, at the University of Florida football game there. During halftime, some prankster released a sack full of armadillos out of the Florida field. So there were thousands of people watching the people running around trying to catch these armadillos, and every time they got close to them, the armadillo would jump at them. And armadillos have very sharp claws and also sharp teeth here. And so they were trying to get around the armadillo that went on the backside there, and it took them about 15 minutes to catch all of these armadillos and get them off the field so they could start the second half of the football game.
I told you were going to learn something new. All right, back there, question.
Did the public sit in on a thing because that art service? Would you say you mentioned hero?
Can any of the public sit in on the art presentations from the Highwaymen? What do you mean by sit in?
Darren, the lady that you said that impersonated.
Oh, so those are on our school tours. So unfortunately at this time, no, just for the safety of the kids, we only let people who've, been background checked around them. But sometimes we do have our historic actors come to some of our events. We've had Dr. Phillips at our History After Dark event. So it is possible eventually if we have, do we have any video by chance of her as Marianne Carroll?
Yeah, we should.
We might have some video, and then we can maybe, if we can find it, we can send it out to the folks who registered so we can find it for you. But good question, and good to know that people want to see Marianne Carroll. All right. Any other questions before we wrap up? Yes.
For the Highwaymen, they were big support here. What was their range of from to sell their art? They were,
Hold on. Someone asked, what was the range of the Highwaymen? They started in Fort Pierce. How far did they go?
They went all up and down the Florida highways. So they would come up to Orlando, they would go down to Miami, they would go over West Palm, Okeechobee, Fort Lauderdale, all over. There's collections all over the state, and that's usually found where they would congregate and sell the most.
was there a reason they were situated in Fort Pierce?
The question was if there was a reason why they were situated in Fort Pierce, and I think that was just the safest place for them to congregate. And then because the Bacchus studio was down there, they mostly stayed there as their home base so they could continue to paint somewhere safely.
Any other questions? All right. If not, well, thank you all so much for joining us today, both in person and online. We hope you enjoyed today's program. Supporting our programming is one of the best ways to support the History Center, so we appreciate you being here today.